Well, the state of U.S. economy was, after the Great Depression, it was being recovered, and it had some kind of fueled throughout the war effort. And it, right after the war, it became and came into a more comfortable position because it was mainly a credit, it gave credit to many other nations. And not only that, but it had a very strong position towards the United Kingdom because of all the land lease operations and the military bases it had agreed with. And from then onwards, America was producing, basically, we're talking about over 1/3 of GDP, and a few years later it became nearly 50% of the world's total GDP. So it was in a very strong position in order to establish the world order it really wanted to establish with its allies, that is the liberal world order by the end of World War II. I think that was the real reason why America felt itself it had to step forward this time. Yes, not like a few years before. It had to basically lead the world. It was the leader of the free world, and it was becoming basically the first really truly global superpower of all times. It had not only, we're talking about economics, but in military terms it had 700, it reached sometime later 700 military bases plus 300 more or less, supposedly 300 alleged secret sites which cover the whole planet. So its military and economic capabilities by the moment were unknown if you look at the past. When you take a look at the last over 20 years of recent history, inequality has risen because the minimum and the median wages for labor, basically if you take inflation into account, they haven't risen, they have stuck. However, if you look at big corporate profits and the highest salaries, they have skyrocketed. So, that's a problem in political terms, in economic terms as well. And from the outside, what you see is that America needs an urgent measures in order to try to solve the situation, because you're probably getting to see it. It's a social bomb, basically. The problem is that free trade is beneficial for America as a whole. So even though it is true that some people are getting hurt, if you end up NAFTA, for example, the whole country is going to suffer more. I mean, those kind of declarations, what they show is that maybe he wants to, he's talking basically playing politics towards his electoral base, or maybe he just doesn't know really what the implications of free trade are, right? So if he finally ends up finishing the NAFTA, for example, and getting out of NAFTA, the whole economy will suffer, right? So it's a complicated issue because he's basically he's upset with the countries which produce trade deficit to America. So he thinks that what is fair or what is good for America is not to have trade deficits with every single country, which is absolutely impossible, basically. I think that if America was to, for example, for the last few days we've been hearing about him wanting to raise tariffs. If he does so, if he basically drops out of free trade agreements, what's going to happen is that the rest of the world are going to start applying World Trade Organization basic tariffs. And not only that, but if he raises tariffs towards other countries, the other countries will surely retaliate. We've seen this in the past. The last time we saw this in America was in 1929 with President Hoover, and because of that and some other economic reasons, the GDP in the United States dropped by over 1/3 in a few years. I've been recently in the United Kingdom. I've spoken to many people about it, and yes, it's we have to understand that because of several reasons. One of them is economic inequality produced by yes, there are some losers to free trade, but there's also a technological revolution, and there's also we're getting out of a recent crisis. So there's an accumulation of problems that people are suffering also in the United Kingdom, and the people that have suffered the most are blaming it because of the populist talk to free trade, for example, or to the EU in this case. That's the reason why the Brexit vote ended how it ended, right? We've had two very large wars. One of them is still going on in Afghanistan, and they have been quite expensive for America. I don't think that is the reason why America, or at least the only reason why America has problems with its budget and economic problems in general. I think it wouldn't be an issue. I think the problems with those wars go farther than that. They have to do with either they are wars that need to be fought or not. The right wars to be in or not, but that's a different issue. I think America, since Bush Sr., President Bush Sr., and the end of the Cold War, and even with Clinton after that, they were. It was clear that it had to be the total hegemon of the world, of the free world. It had to try to keep applying the rules and the ideas and the ideals it had implemented since the end of the Cold War. It was a great opportunity to expand democracy and free markets and the values of human rights all over the world. But for some reason, after the end of the century, something got wrong, and in my opinion, instead of trying to lead by example and trying to establish a peaceful primacy based on the values of the true America, of the Founding Fathers, the other America, the other soul struggles with the Founding Fathers' core Western values, sometimes try to come and dominate. I'm talking about the other outlook, which is somewhat different from the core Western outlook, and thinks that by maybe neocolonization or empire building, things might go fine. America will remain ever stronger, and there are not moral or ethical problems with that, and there won't be blowbacks in the future regarding, I'm talking about basically the approach to Afghanistan. There's something to discuss about that, but especially Iraq. I think the president that came after that, it was so evident that it was a mistake that Obama applied a very different foreign policy and tried to go back a bit more to the values of the Founding Fathers, that is primacy, but not isolationism, but friendship among nations, and the main objective of the United Nations, which is peace among peoples on earth. Yes, it is evident that they are a product of Bretton Woods. I think one of the objectives, if not the main one, is regarding the World Bank, is development. But after all, it's economic development through trade. That is, try to keep exchange rates stable and have an environment that promotes and permits global trade to flourish. And through that way, not only America, but the whole world would obtain benefits, because the freer the trade, the more the trade, and the more the trade, the higher the growth in America and the rest of the world. Well, I think that's an idea that even Ronald Reagan spoke about. After that, there's been some criticism, and I think it has been President Obama, the one who has made some comments about it, trying to cool down the notion of exceptionalism, because I think that basically some people like Obama and even the founding fathers, or Woodrow Wilson probably, or even the people who were establishing Franklin Delano Roosevelt and then Truman, planning for the liberal world order, they were all very much in favor of a view that wouldn't emphasize so much a manifest destiny. That is, America is a great country, but it depends on how you take exceptionalism. But if you take it literally, it is somewhat risky, and it can lead you to behavior, especially in foreign policy terms, that can get you into trouble. I'm talking about, for example, the most recent example, Iraq. But but this is I'm just doubting a lot about how to answer, because I have this is one of the issues I wanted to speak about. Well, Pax Americana, it's a very common term, and it's based on Pax Britannica or Pax Romana. It refers to the liberal world order established right after the Second World War. And for many people, and even for myself, it doesn't have a very negative connotation. But for some people, it does. If you get strict, you'll realize that in reality, it's not exactly what America, the true America, or the world needed. I mean, if you get strict, what you would say is that it doesn't, the term or the notion doesn't answer the expectations of the people that planned the liberal world order led by the US. It doesn't answer their expectations, and it doesn't belong either to the notions and to the world outlook that I was talking about, the true American soul, which is the founding fathers. You have many important figures in America, I would say most of them, that felt identified and belonged to the core Western outlook, that is the founding fathers outlook. One of them was President John Kennedy, who in 1963, in the summer, in a famous speech, in his very own words, he said something along the lines of, "What kind of peace do I mean? What kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war, but a peace to all men and women on earth, not the peace of the grave, nor the security of the slave." And he went on speaking, and at the end of the speech, and this was in the middle of the Cold War, he was more specific and said, after all, we all inhabit this small planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Okay, the liberal world order has been widely beneficial to the world in general terms, but it hasn't been like that all the time, and especially everywhere. This is somewhat a paradox. It's incoherent because it's been America itself, the country that among other allies established the rules of the liberal world order at the end of World War II. So it's been America itself which at certain times has kind of betrayed those same ideas. Why do I say this? Because if you take a look at the last 70 years of American interventions abroad, I'm talking about military interventions or CIA covert operations abroad, many of them were intended to topple foreign government and substitute it with a friendlier one. So in some of these occasions, you can analyze and see there's an economic benefit among the equation. There were probably other intentions and other reasons for doing such, but there was also an important and immediate economic benefit for American corporations in terms of trade. So when we reach to this and we revise this side of the story of the last 70 years, and we see these exceptions to the rule that the American liberal world order has been beneficial, then it makes you wonder, why can something like this have happened in recent times? And I think the answer is that America has two souls, so to speak, in general terms. One of them is the Founding Fathers, the core Western outlook, which is in favor of inclusiveness and therefore of friendliness among nations on earth. It has a positive view of human nature. And this view is responsible for the drawing of the Constitution, of course, but also for Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, or the liberal order that we're living in today. And there's another outlook which came in the Mayflower with the Puritans, that was bringing many interesting ideas for American culture, but also some others that were not exactly compatible with the Western outlook the majority of Americans had. So how was this new worldview exactly? It had its roots close to dualism, and therefore it was a type of Manichaeism. The Puritan outlook basically answered in a too simplistic way complicated questions about human existence. For example, with an either or instead of a both, what it tended to do was to see the world, for example, see evil as a positive entity instead of mere absence of good. And that way things started to turn simple black versus white, total good versus total evil. And that way even peoples or nations themselves could be considered within an axis of evil themselves, right? This simplistic view at the end was also a bit pessimistic about human nature and about the material world itself. So it was more inclined towards nationalism, isolationism, and even mercantilism when dealing with foreign peoples and foreign nations. For the last 70 years, America has done a good job for the world in general terms, and that's very good news. But we have to be honest and realize that sometimes, because of some people influenced by whatever culture and some other ideas or greed or whatever, it has been unfaithful and have betrayed the ideas of the Founding Fathers and of the American spirit, basically. So what can be done about that? Well, what I think is that America could do on a national level what Georgetown University has done with regards to slavery and its past, which is to establish a panel of experts, study thoroughly, look at the good and the not so good, maybe come to conclusions and even apologize if necessary. And that way the country will get away with that experience much stronger and freer, in my opinion. Well, definitely, because we cannot deny that China has somehow had an impact, a negative impact on certain sectors, especially productive manufacturing jobs in America. But I think as a whole it has benefited America itself because, as I just said, trade relations and increasing trade relations are good for both countries, even for the one that has a trade deficit. So in that sense, yes, it is a competitor, you have to compete with them, but you have to open yourselves, your economy to them, because after all, the contrary will be, the opposite will be worse, right? So it's a competition that, it's a win-win competition. I don't think it should, if you take the countries as a whole. But you have to, of course, take a look and try to find the solutions to the sectors that got hurt the most. And ideologically, yes, because China has basically evolved and for a lot of years now. It has opened its economy, but it's pragmatic option for them because they think it's good for them, but they have shown that their vision of the world, their outlook, their political system is still very far away from the American values themselves. I think the role for China has been exaggerated for some people over the last few years, and especially when compared to the US. When we compare both economies, we do it in purchasing power parity terms, and I think it's more important to look at the real terms, GDP in real terms. If you do that and you look at other variables such as GDP per person, etc., you see that China had a few years ago a very long path ahead in order to truly get close to America's strength in economic and political terms. So this is something I don't want to say this like this predicted, but this is something that I thought a few years from now in the past, and this is something that I think is being confirmed, and we'll see what happens in the future. But that shows that America's strength and primacy has maybe a longer path ahead than many expected. You have to look at the numbers very carefully because in general terms, in absolute terms, it did. But if you look at it in relative terms to GDP, the spending on defense decreased since the 60s. It has been decreasing for America. Then it raised again, I would say, at the Bush Jr. presidency. When you have a threat as the one America faced during the Cold War, it's obvious that the increasing power of the defense it's going to have an impact in economic terms. Yes, in the 50s, America was facing a threat. It decided that it had to basically face it, and absolutely it decided to invest a lot in bases abroad, especially throughout Europe and Eurasia, and there was a lot of investment done in nuclear weapons in order to basically, of course, not necessarily to use them, but to show such a strength that Russia would be disincentivated to do anything just because of fears of mutual destruction. I think in spending money for the State Department is very important because American presence abroad is basically, which is important, not to go back to isolationism. It's produced by spending money through the State Department. And when America is spending a lot on defense, I don't think that it needs to be increased. So I think the balance should go back again towards more spending in the State Department, on diplomacy, on help for human urgencies, the underdeveloped, the countries that are on the verge of falling into a social crisis or dictatorships, etc.